I want you to picture something for a moment. A quiet room, early in the morning, doing something small and ordinary, the kind of thing you've done 1,000 times without thinking about it. It's not dramatic. Nobody's crying. Nothing's on fire. There's no emergency to point to. It's just quiet. The kind of quiet that used to mean peace and somewhere along the way started meaning something closer to absence. That's the moment I want to start with, because I think more people are living inside a version of that moment than most of us are willing to say out loud. We don't talk about it. Before I go any further, if you're new here, welcome, and if any part of what I've said so far already sounds like something you needed to hear, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because I don't want you to lose track of this channel before we get to the part of the story that actually matters most. I say that not because I need the number to go up for its own sake, though of course that helps keep this going, but because I've heard from enough people by now to know that these stories tend to find the people who need them at exactly the moment they need them, sometimes long after they first subscribed, scrolling back through late at night during a hard stretch, looking for something that says plainly, "You are not the only person who has felt this way." If that ends up being you someday, I want to make sure this is easy to find again. So take care of that now. It takes 2 seconds, and then let's keep going, because there's quite a bit more to this story, and I don't think the version I've told you so far does justice to where it actually ends up. I want you to picture something for me. You're sitting in a doctor's office, not because anything is wrong exactly, just a routine checkup, the kind you've had every year for 2 decades, and your doctor looks at you across that little exam table and says, calmly, professionally, without any particular drama, that you need to slow down. Not because you've been running marathons. Not because you've been working 16-hour days. Just because you're 70, and 70 is apparently the age at which the medical establishment has collectively decided that the appropriate pace of a human life should begin its long, dignified deceleration towards something nobody actually names out loud, but everyone in that room understands perfectly well. And you drive home from that appointment, and you sit in your driveway, and you think, for the first time in your life, with genuine seriousness, is this it? Is this the part where I just get smaller and quieter until I disappear? Because I have to tell you, from where I'm sitting right now, with the window open and a breeze coming off a lake that has an actual volcano sitting in the middle of it, that question deserved a better answer than the one I almost accepted. My name is Wyatt Hughes. I'm 72 years old, and 14 months ago I moved to a small city on the island of Cebu in the Philippines, having never lived outside the state of Colorado in my entire life, having never even seriously entertained the idea of living outside the United States, and having been told by my own doctor, in a conversation I'll describe in full because it matters to how this story starts, that my primary health goal going forward should be to avoid stress and take it easy. I want to tell you what happened when I decided, after sitting with that advice for about 8 months, that taking it easy was possibly the worst thing I could do for myself, and that what I actually needed was the opposite of smaller and the opposite of quieter, and several thousand miles in the direction of something I couldn't fully picture yet, but could feel pulling at me, the way certain things pull at you when you've gone quiet enough inside to finally hear them. Before I get into any of this, if stories like this one speak to something you've been quietly thinking about yourself, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because there's a lot more of this kind of thing coming, and I think you'll want to be here for it. I spent 34 years as an architect, not the glamorous kind you see in movies, not the kind designing landmark buildings in Chicago, or glass towers in New York, but the kind that designs the schools your kids went to, and the libraries your town uses, and the municipal buildings that quietly hold a community together, without anyone ever particularly noticing them, or crediting anyone for their existence. I worked for a firm in Denver for most of those years, made partner eventually, spent the better part of 2 decades managing projects and client relationships, and the particular exhausting diplomacy required when a city council has 12 opinions about where to put a lobby. I retired at 67, which felt early to some people, and which felt, to me, like roughly the right moment, a point at which I had enough saved, enough sense, and just enough residual energy to do something meaningful with whatever came next. My wife Ellen and I had been talking about what retirement would look like for most of our 60s, the way couples do when they're good at planning and slightly too optimistic about their own ability to execute plans they make, while still fully occupied with other things. We'd talk on long drives about where we might travel, what we might learn, whether we'd get serious about the sailing lessons we'd been vaguely promising ourselves since our late 40s, whether we'd finally spend significant time with our daughter Cassie and her family in Portland, or whether that, too, would remain a plan that never quite solidified into weeks on the calendar. The truth is, most of those conversations were a kind of pleasant fiction, a way of enjoying the idea of a future without having to actually commit to its specifics, and I think we both knew that, and neither of us minded, because knowing something will change without knowing exactly how it'll change is about the best you can do with most things in life, and we'd been married long enough to be comfortable with that degree of uncertainty. Ellen died 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. The particular cruelty of a disease that introduces itself only when it has already finished making its plans. She was 58. I was 59. We had, by any reasonable measure, expected to have at least another 25 years of those long drives and those pleasant fictions about sailing lessons and time in Portland. And instead, I drove home from the hospital on a November night and stood in our kitchen and understood, with a completeness I haven't fully been able to describe in the 11 years since, that an entire imagined future had simply ceased to exist while I was sitting in a waiting room trying to finish a crossword puzzle. I won't dwell too long on those years, not because they don't matter, but because they're a different story from the one I'm trying to tell you today. I'll say this much. I kept working for 8 more years after Ellen died, and I think I kept working largely because work was the only container that reliably held me together. The one structure that gave my days shape and purpose, and the particular relief of being needed. And when I finally retired at 67, the thing I hadn't fully accounted for was how much of my identity had been quietly stored in that container, and how strange it would feel to stand outside it for the first time in 4 decades, without Ellen there to stand beside me. For the first couple of years of retirement I managed reasonably well, or at least I managed in ways that looked reasonable to everyone watching. I took a woodworking class at the community center, built some genuinely mediocre furniture that Cassie graciously pretended to admire. I traveled a little, a week in Costa Rica, a few days in New Mexico, nothing particularly ambitious, but enough to feel like I was moving through the world intentionally, rather than just occupying a fixed point within it. I read constantly, always had, but now, with the kind of uninterrupted depth that working life never permits, 3 or 4 books at a time, whole weeks lost inside histories and biographies, and the occasional novel, long enough to feel like actually living somewhere else for a while. But something was thinning. I noticed it the way you notice the light changing in autumn, gradually, then suddenly, the days slightly shorter, before you've consciously registered the shift. I was managing my time effectively. I was ticking appropriate boxes. I was, by any external measure, a man in retirement who had things going reasonably well. What I wasn't doing, and what I found increasingly difficult to explain to myself, in a way that didn't sound either ungrateful or melodramatic, was actually feeling engaged, actually feeling the texture of days, rather than just moving through them, waking up with something to look forward to, that wasn't just a scheduled distraction from the question of what I was supposed to be doing with the rest of my life. I turned 70 on a Saturday in March, 3 years ago, and Cassie threw a small dinner for me in Denver, with a handful of old friends and colleagues, and it was genuinely lovely, the kind of evening you'd describe afterward, with warmth and mean it. And I drove home that night and sat in the same chair I sit in most evenings, and looked at the walls of the house I've lived in for 22 years, the house Ellen and I bought together, and that I've been living in alone for 11, and I thought, with the particular clarity that round-numbered birthdays sometimes bring without warning, that if I was going to have another 20 years, I didn't want them to look like the last 3. Not because the last 3 had been bad, but because they'd been survivable, and survivable is a low bar to set for your own existence. And somewhere in that thought was the beginning of everything that came after. The doctor's appointment was about 3 months after that birthday. My physician, a careful, thorough man named Dr. Aranda, who'd been my doctor for over a decade, and who I trusted precisely because he never told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was more useful, ran his usual battery of tests and sat down with me afterward to go through the results. Blood pressure slightly elevated, nothing alarming, cholesterol manageable but worth watching more closely. Joints starting to register the particular complaints that joints apparently begin lodging around 70 as a matter of biological protocol. Nothing was wrong exactly, nothing requiring intervention, nothing urgent. But Dr. Aranda, being the kind of doctor he was, didn't just read the numbers. He looked at me across his desk and asked me, the same way I imagine a good doctor always eventually asks, whether I was actually doing well, not medically, but as a person inhabiting a life. I told him what I thought was the honest answer, which was that I was fine, I was getting along, I had my routines and my books and my occasional trips, and things were, overall, manageable. He listened to all of that, nodded slowly, and then said something that I've turned over in my mind probably 1,000 times since, something that landed differently than he probably intended it to when he said it. He told me, kindly, that at my age, the priority had to be avoiding major stressors, managing what was already showing in the numbers before it became something harder to manage, and that the goal from here forward was to keep things stable, steady, uncomplicated. He said I should slow down. Now, Dr. Aranda meant well. He is a good doctor, and I believe genuinely that he was giving me the standard, medically reasonable advice for a man of 70 with slightly elevated blood pressure and aging joints, and a life that, from a clinical perspective, appeared to be under control. He wasn't prescribing me despair. He wasn't telling me my life was over. But I drove home from that appointment, and I sat with what he'd said, and the word that kept surfacing, the word that sat in the pit of my chest with a weight I couldn't shake off, was small. Not the word he'd used, but the word I kept hearing underneath the word he'd used. Slow down, keep things stable, manage what's there before it gets worse. All of it, added together, translated in my mind into something that sounded less like medical advice and more like a gentle recommendation to begin the long process of making myself smaller, quieter, less, and to accept that as not just an outcome, but as a reasonable goal. I sat with that for 8 months. That's an honest number, 8 months of sitting with it, which is longer than it probably needed to take, but which is, I think, roughly how long it takes a certain kind of stubborn, independent man from Colorado to admit that the thing making him feel hollow isn't a medical problem, and isn't a logistical problem, and isn't anything anyone else can fix for him. It took 8 months, and a conversation I hadn't expected to have, with a person I hadn't expected to meet, in a place I hadn't planned to be, to finally shake something loose. I had gone to Portland for 3 weeks to spend time with Cassie and her husband David and their 2 kids, my grandchildren, Lily, who was 9 at the time, and Marcus, who was 11, and it was the best 3 weeks I'd had in a long time. The specific, uncomplicated joy of children who want your company for its own sake, and who don't worry about whether you're eating properly, or sleeping enough, or filling your days meaningfully. We built things in the backyard. Marcus and I spent an entire afternoon constructing an elaborate and structurally dubious birdhouse that he insisted on designing himself, and that I, as an architect with 34 years of experience, had the specific pleasure of watching absolutely defy all reasonable structural expectations by not immediately collapsing. Lily made me sit through approximately every film she considered essential viewing,
a list heavily weighted toward animated features she'd already seen enough times to recite along with dialogue, and I sat through all of them with the specific contentment of a man who has nowhere else to be and no desire to be anywhere else. David had a colleague visiting from out of town that second week.
They came to visit eventually, and I could tell, the moment they landed, that they were nervous about exactly what they were going to find, having spent months imagining a version of my new life that was probably far bleaker than the reality actually turned out to be. I watched them do the thing I think every skeptical loved one does when they finally see something in person instead of hearing about it second-hand over occasional phone calls. The worry on their face slowly gave way, over the course of just a few days, to something closer to relief, and eventually something closer to genuine happiness on my behalf, watching me move through an ordinary day in a life that clearly had real shape and real people in it, not the isolated, uncertain existence they'd apparently been quietly picturing all along. On the last night of that visit, sitting together somewhere quiet, they said something that stayed with me long after they'd flown home, some version of admitting they'd expected to find someone lonelier, smaller, more diminished than the person actually sitting in front of them. I told them that was more or less exactly what I'd feared finding in myself too, in those uncertain early months, and that I understood completely why they'd worried the way they had. But I also told them, and meant it fully, that worry built on imagination rarely survives contact with the actual lived truth of a situation, and that I was glad they'd finally gotten to see the truth of it for themselves, instead of continuing to worry about a version of my life that had never actually existed.
A man named Glenn, retired military, who'd spent the previous 18 months living between the Philippines and his home state of Oregon after retiring from the Navy. He and David were close enough that Glenn had the run of the house the way old friends do, showing up at meals, staying up too late on the back porch with drinks, the kind of easy, comfortable presence that tells you instantly that two people have known each other through enough difficult things to have stopped being formal around each other. I liked Glenn immediately, the way you sometimes like people because they seem to occupy their own skin without strain, without performance, without any particular effort to manage how they come across. We ended up on that back porch one night, just the two of us, David having gone in to get the kids settled, and Glenn started talking about the Philippines, the way people talk about places that have gotten under their skin and rearranged something important. Not evangelizing, not the breathless pitch of someone trying to sell you on a decision, just describing his life there, with the relaxed specificity of someone recounting ordinary days that happened to have become extraordinary to him. He talked about the food first, which I noticed because people who've actually lived somewhere rather than just visited it tend to talk about the food in the specific way that tells you it's become personal to them. He talked about a breakfast place near his apartment in Cebu City that had been run by the same woman for 30 years, about a soup he'd eaten in the mountains of Benguet on a cold morning that he still thought about regularly, about the particular ritual of the fresh market on weekend mornings, still alive in a way that markets in most American cities had stopped being alive sometime in the previous several decades. Then he talked about the people, and this was where something in me that had been sitting very still for 8 months began to shift. He said, and I remember this precisely, that the thing no one warns you about before you move somewhere like that is that you'll be treated like a person before you've earned it. He meant it as a compliment, though he acknowledged it sounded strange. He said that in the Philippines, and in Cebu in particular, the default setting for how people interact with strangers is warmth, not the practiced warmth of a service industry designed to extract your goodwill, but the actual warmth of a culture that has organized itself around other people as a genuine value rather than a social performance. He said he'd moved there feeling like a man who'd been quietly invisible for years, not unhappy exactly, just unremarkable, and he'd arrived somewhere that seemed genuinely interested in him for no better reason than that he was there, and that seeming interested in people was simply what people did. I asked him about the practical things, because I'm a practical person, and because the practical things are what you turn to when the larger thing you're actually thinking about is too new to speak to directly yet. I asked about healthcare, and he walked me through it thoroughly. I asked about cost of living, and he gave me specific numbers: apartment costs, food, transportation, the things you can actually run calculations on. I asked about safety, which is the question anyone from the United States eventually gets to, and he answered it honestly, neither dismissing the concern nor amplifying it, just describing his actual experience, the specific neighborhoods he knew, the common-sense approaches that had served him well, the way any honest person describes a place they actually inhabit, rather than a place they're trying to make sound appealing. I didn't say much during most of that conversation. Glenn is the kind of man who understands that some conversations need to be had in silence from one end of them, and he didn't push, didn't follow up the next morning to continue, just let the night close around everything he'd described, and let me carry it back to wherever I was going to put it. I flew home to Denver 4 days later, with something different happening in the back of my mind than had been happening there for 8 months, something less like a weight and more like a question, which felt, by comparison, almost like relief. I spent about 3 weeks doing research that I initially told myself was just curiosity, the same way I imagine everyone tells themselves initially that the thing they're doing is just curiosity. I read about Cebu specifically, which Glenn had focused on, a city on an island in the central Philippines called the Visayas, the second largest city in the country, old enough to have been a trading port before most American cities existed, warm almost year-round, with the particular heat of a coastal tropical city that is softened, in the older neighborhoods and on the higher ground, by ocean breeze in a way that makes it genuinely livable rather than just endurable. I read about the Special Resident Retirees Visa, the SRUV, which the Philippine Retirement Authority had designed specifically to make this kind of move accessible, requiring a deposit rather than an ongoing income threshold, renewable, allowing its holders to live in the country indefinitely, with the freedom to enter and exit without restriction. I read expat forums the way I used to read project documentation when I was still working, systematically, with the particular focused attention of someone trying to understand a system well enough to operate within it confidently. I read posts from Americans and Australians and Europeans who'd made this move in their 60s and 70s, who wrote about it with the specific texture of people describing real lives rather than ideal ones, the good and the complicated, and the things they'd gotten wrong, and the things they'd figured out only by getting them wrong first. I read one post from a retired teacher in California who'd moved to a neighborhood in Cebu called Lahug 3 years earlier, and who wrote, without drama or exaggeration, that the previous 3 years had been the most genuinely alive she'd felt since her 40s, and she was careful to explain what she meant by that. Not that everything was easier or more comfortable or better in the material sense, but that she was engaged, daily, with actual human beings in actual communities doing actual things that mattered to people, and that the difference between that and what she'd had in California was the difference between watching the world and being in it. I called Glenn. He answered on the second ring, in the middle of what turned out to be a Saturday morning at a market in Cebu, and I could hear the noise of it behind his voice, the particular ambient richness of an outdoor market that is fully alive with people who have somewhere specific to be. I told him I'd been doing research, and he said he'd figured I might, said it with the easy humor of a man who'd seen this exact pattern before, and he offered, without my asking, to answer whatever questions I still had, to connect me with people he knew there, to do whatever was actually useful as opposed to just encouraging. We talked for almost an hour, and by the end of it, the thing I'd been calling curiosity for 3 weeks had quietly renamed itself something closer to intention, and I made the decision on that phone call, not formally, not with any announcement, but in the private, internal way that real decisions actually happen, somewhere before the formal announcement, somewhere in the moment you stop asking whether and start thinking about how. I told Cassie on a Sunday in January, about 4 months before I actually moved. I want to describe that conversation honestly, because it was not the simple, comfortable conversation I had hoped it might be, and pretending otherwise would be both dishonest and unfair to Cassie, who handled something difficult with considerably more grace than I would have managed in her position. She went very quiet when I told her, the specific quiet of a person processing something, rather than the quiet of a person who has nothing to say. Then she asked, carefully, whether I understood what I was talking about, not as a dismissal, but as a genuine question from a daughter who had lost her mother at 58 and who was looking at her father, the only parent she had left, and being asked to accept that he intended to live 8,000 miles away from her from this point forward. We talked for a long time. She asked about healthcare, as everyone does, and I walked her through what I'd learned in detail, the quality of the hospitals in Cebu, the international health insurance I'd already begun researching, the specific cost comparisons that were, once you understood them, genuinely striking. She asked about safety, and I gave her Glenn's honest assessment and my own research. She asked, at some point, more quietly, whether this was about running away from something rather than toward something, and I appreciated the directness of the question enough to give it the honest, considered answer it deserved, which was that it was both, and that I thought both were legitimate, and that the thing I was running toward felt real and specific, while the thing I was running from was nothing more than the gradual narrowing of a life I wasn't willing to let narrow any further. She cried, not angrily, more with the particular sadness of someone coming to terms with a change they know is real and right for the person they love, but that costs them something personally. I told her something that I want to be clear I believed entirely, that moving to the Philippines was not moving away from her or from Marcus and Lily, that I intended to come back for visits with a regularity that I planned to be serious about, and that she was welcome to come to Cebu for as long as she wanted, as often as she wanted, and that I already had a second bedroom in mind, specifically with that in mind. She wiped her eyes and nodded and said, in the particular way that Cassie signals genuine acceptance, which is different from polite acquiescence, and which I have come to recognize precisely over 24 years of being her father, that she thought Mum would have beaten her to the suggestion by about 6 months. I spent the 4 months between that conversation and my actual departure doing the work of actually making the move real rather than just decided. I contacted the Philippine Retirement Authority about the SARV and worked through the application process, which was more organized and navigable than I'd anticipated. I retained an attorney in Denver to make sure everything on the estate and financial side was properly documented and structured, not because I was pessimistic, but because I was systematic, and systematic people don't move to the other side of the world without making sure their paperwork is in order. I researched international health insurance with the same thoroughness I'd once applied to project specifications, eventually settling on a policy specifically designed for retirees abroad that covered both the kind of routine care that's almost certainly never going to become the emergency you're not prepared for, and the kind of emergency that's statistically unlikely, but that you'd never forgive yourself for not being prepared for. I made contact, through Glenn, with a man named Rodrigo, who managed several rental properties in a quieter part of Lahug, the neighborhood in Cebu that Glenn had recommended as a good balance between access and calm, close enough to the city's resources, but removed enough from its full noise to feel like you actually lived somewhere, rather than just existed in the middle of somewhere. Rodrigo was patient and methodical over email, sending photographs and measurements, answering specific questions about water pressure and internet service with the detail-oriented responsiveness of a man who'd dealt with enough fastidious foreign tenants to understand that the specific questions mattered. I rented a 2-bedroom unit, sight unseen, which I acknowledged to myself was not the most architect-like thing I'd ever done in terms of site evaluation, but which felt like the appropriate amount of commitment, to an intention I'd already made. I flew to Cebu on a Thursday in late April, a direct flight from Los Angeles to Manila, and then a short connecting flight south to Mactan Cebu International Airport, arriving at night to the warm, heavy air of the tropics and the particular sensory density of arriving somewhere completely new after a journey long enough to have already shed, in transit, most of your sense of exactly who you are in your ordinary context. Glenn met me at the airport, which he had offered to do and which I had accepted gratefully, having no illusions about how disorienting the first hours in a genuinely unfamiliar place can be, even for a person who thought they prepared thoroughly. He drove me to the apartment, helped me identify which key opened which lock, showed me the nearest market and the nearest pharmacy on a route he'd clearly driven specifically to orientate me, and then left me alone with my 2 suitcases and the kind of quiet that a new apartment has before you've filled it with any life yet. I want to be honest about the first weeks in the way I think these stories require honesty to actually be useful to anyone hearing them. The first weeks were not a montage of immediate joy and effortless belonging. They were genuinely hard, in ways I'd half anticipated, and in ways that surprised me. The heat was more present than I'd prepared for, not unbearable, manageable with the apartment's air conditioning and the ocean breeze that came in off the Visayan Sea on most evenings, but present in a way that required adjustment, a recalibration of how much I could do in the middle of the day, and when it made more sense to simply be still. I got lost on my first 3 independent walks, genuinely, uselessly lost, in a way that required eventually stopping at a small convenience store and asking for help in English from a teenager behind the counter who navigated me home with the casual helpfulness of someone for whom helping lost foreigners is simply a normal part of a Thursday afternoon. The food required learning, and the learning was its own kind of unexpected pleasure. I didn't know what I was ordering at most of the small eateries near the apartment for the first 2 weeks, and I ate based on pointing and hoping, which produced several revelations and a few experiences I'll simply call educational. There was a dish called lechon, roasted pork, prepared in a way that has apparently been perfected in Cebu over generations, and that possesses a quality I can only describe as unreasonable, a dish that arrives looking like something architectural and tastes like an argument for staying where you are permanently. There was a soup called sinigang, sour and savory and rich, in a way that seems paradoxical until you eat it, and then seems obvious, the kind of food that makes you feel like your body specifically needed it rather than just wanted it. There was fresh fish prepared simply in ways that reminded me there are entire categories of what food can taste like that I'd simply not had access to in 40 years of Colorado living, landlocked and well-fed, but apparently not fully informed. I met Glenn's circle gradually, over the first month, through dinners and weekend mornings at the market, and the kind of casual, ongoing social structure that forms around a person who has been somewhere long enough to know everyone, and who introduces you by name to people you've just met, with the ease of someone who expects those introductions to become friendships. There was a man named Tom, a retired engineer from Arizona, who'd been in Cebu for 8 years, and who had the particular contentment of someone who'd stopped measuring his life against its former version and started measuring it against itself, day by day, which he recommended, with some force, as a significant upgrade to most alternative approaches to measuring one's life. There was a woman named Susan, a retired professor from Vancouver, not American but sharing enough of the general North American experience to be immediately relatable, who spent her mornings tutoring local university students in English composition and her afternoons painting, badly by her own assessment, but joyfully by everyone else's, at a table on her balcony, overlooking a garden that her landlady kept with the specific devotion of a woman for whom plants were not a hobby, but a vocation. There was a Filipino couple, Manny and Gloria, who'd spent 30 years in the United States before retiring back to Cebu, which was where Gloria's family had always been, and who occupied an interesting position in the community as people who understood both contexts from the inside, who could translate not just language, but the specific cultural distances that Americans arriving in the Philippines sometimes hadn't anticipated navigating. Gloria had taken it upon herself, apparently voluntarily and without any great ceremony, to ensure that any new foreign arrival in their social circle understood enough about local customs and courtesies to not inadvertently cause offense, which she executed less as instruction and more as ongoing commentary, warm and direct and very funny, delivered over meals and walks, and the kind of long, unhurried conversations that become possible when your days are no longer structured around anything urgent. About 3 months in, I had a day that I want to describe because I think it represents, better than any single event, what was actually changing. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I had no particular plans beyond going to the market in the morning and reading in the afternoon, the kind of unstructured day that, in Denver, would have felt shapeless to me, a day I was merely occupying rather than using. I went to the market and ran into Manny, and we walked together for an hour, just talking, wandering through stalls of fruit I was still learning to name, stopping at a small stall that sold nothing but a single kind of grilled corn, and where the man running it, a man I'd seen every market morning for weeks, and whose name I finally learned was Ernesto, had apparently been watching me look confused about the appropriate protocol for ordering, and decided this was the morning to simply hand me an ear and wave off the money with the decisive generosity of someone who has decided you are no longer a stranger, and that's all there is to it. Manny laughed at my expression. Ernesto laughed at my expression. I ate my corn and thought, with a clarity that actually surprised me, that this was the specific thing Dr. Aranda's advice had been unable to account for, that the medicine I apparently needed was not stability, but texture, was not managed calm, but genuine, unrepeatable, unplannable human contact, and that I'd driven home from his office and sat in my driveway, understanding in my bones that his prescription was the wrong one, but not yet knowing what the right one was. I started volunteering about 4 months after I arrived, not because I'd planned to, not because I'd researched it or included it in any preparation, but because Susan mentioned one afternoon that a community organization she was loosely connected to was looking for someone with a design background to consult on a renovation project at a local after-school center, a building that had gotten some funding for improvements but that didn't have the budget for an actual architect, and needed someone who understood space and structure well enough to help them use their resources sensibly. I said I'd come take a look. I went on a Wednesday morning, and I walked through a building that had good bones, genuinely good bones, that needed better light and better flow, and someone who understood how to get both, without the kind of budget that might have been required if the problem had been more fundamental. I came back on Friday with some sketches. I came back the following week with revised sketches, after sitting down with the 2 staff members who ran the center and actually listening to how they used the space, what the kids needed, what worked badly, and what worked well, and what they'd always wished they could change if they'd had the means. The renovation took 3 months, volunteer work on my part, actual skilled labor from a local contractor who turned out to be excellent and who, like most excellent tradespeople everywhere in the world, required not direction, but simply a clear specification and the respect of being allowed to execute it, the way a person who knows what they're doing should be allowed to execute things. On the day it was finished, a Saturday in September, when the light was coming in through new windows I'd specified, in positions that caught the afternoon in a way I'd calculated from the building's orientation, the center's staff threw a small gathering that was supposed to be modest and turned into something rather larger as family members and neighbors arrived throughout the afternoon, and there was a moment, standing in a room I'd helped make better, watching children do homework in light that actually served the purpose, that I felt something I recognized from 30 years of project completions but hadn't felt in the 5 years since I'd retired. the specific satisfaction of having made something real that served actual people, and that would continue serving them long after I'd stopped being present to observe it. The director of the center, a woman named Imelda, who had been running after-school programming for disadvantaged children in Cebu for 15 years, and who possessed a degree of organizational efficiency that made me feel, as a former project manager, genuinely humbled, asked me the following week whether I'd be willing to stay involved on an ongoing basis, not necessarily for construction projects, though they had ideas about those, but for longer-term planning, helping them think about how to use their physical space more effectively as their programming grew and their needs changed. I said yes, without thinking about it very long, which was itself notable, because I'm a person who thinks about things a long time, and the speed of that yes told me something about where I actually was now, compared to where I'd been. I want to describe the healthcare moment, because I promised honesty, and because I think it's the thing most people my age worry about more than anything else when they consider something like this. About 6 months in, on a Sunday afternoon, I developed what I immediately recognized as a kidney stone, having had one once before, at 53, and having no illusions about mistaking the particular character of that pain for anything else. I found a hospital nearby, one that Glenn had specifically walked me through during that first orientation drive, and whose name I'd saved in my phone for exactly this kind of moment, and I was in an emergency room within 40 minutes of deciding I needed to go. The facility was clean and modern and efficiently run. The physician who saw me spoke excellent English and knew exactly what he was looking at, from the imaging without any drama. The pain management was administered promptly and effectively, and I was discharged 6 hours later with a clear understanding of what had happened and what to watch for, and a bill that I looked at for a long time afterward, the way you look at something that contradicts a belief you've held for so long you'd stopped examining it. The entire visit, imaging, medication, physician fees, everything, came to an amount in US dollars that I will simply describe as dramatically less than the co-payment alone would have been in Denver, and the care was, by any objective measure I could apply, thoroughly competent and entirely appropriate. I called Cassie the next morning, not in alarm, just to report, because that was what we'd agreed on, and because I didn't want her to find out second-hand and spend a week anxious. She was quiet on the other end for a moment, and then she asked who had been with me, and I told her I'd called Glenn when I realized I was going to need to go in, and that Glenn had driven me and sat in the waiting room for the entire 6 hours, and that Tom had shown up somewhere around hour 4, having been called by Glenn, and that Manny and Gloria had called the next morning before I'd had a chance to let anyone know I was home and fine. She was quiet again, a different kind of quiet than the first kind, and then she said something that I think was harder for her to say than it sounds, which was that she was glad I wasn't alone there, and she meant it, which I could tell, and which meant more to me than I knew how to respond to in the moment, without making the conversation more emotional than either of us was prepared for on a Monday morning. I want to talk about what my body actually did over these 14 months, because the title of this story is about a doctor telling me to slow down, and I think you deserve to know what actually happened when I ignored that advice in the specific ways I chose to ignore it. My blood pressure, at the last check 6 months ago with a local physician I'd found through Imelda's recommendation, was lower than it had been at the appointment with Dr. Aranda, lower by a meaningful amount, and my physician here asked me, genuinely curious, what I'd changed. I told her I'd moved to Cebu and stopped trying to manage a life that had stopped fitting me. She wrote down lifestyle change in my file, which I thought was technically accurate, while perhaps missing some of the finer nuances. I walk more than I have since my 30s, not because I've imposed a fitness regimen on myself, but because everything is more walkable here, and because walking somewhere specific with a purpose, to the market, to the center, to meet Glenn for coffee at the place near his apartment that has been serving the same recipe for 30 years, is fundamentally different in how it registers in your body than walking because your doctor told you to get more exercise. My joints, which Dr. Aranda had mentioned with concern, are less bothersome than they were in Denver, which my physician here attributes to the warmth and, she suspects, to the simple fact that I'm moving more naturally throughout the day rather than sitting in the particular frozen stillness of a man who has run out of good reasons to get up and go somewhere. I sleep better, which had been a genuine problem for several years in Denver, the kind of shallow, restless sleep that comes from lying in the dark with too many unresolved questions and not enough morning to look forward to. I weigh 7 pounds less than I weighed when I left Denver, which I attribute almost entirely to the food, not to eating less, but to eating differently, to the particular nutrition of fresh food, prepared simply and eaten socially, and in the rhythm of a day that has texture, a day where lunch is a real event with real people, rather than something assembled from whatever's available in the kitchen of a house I'm occupying alone. I turn 72 in March, and I have a calendar for the week of my birthday that I want to describe because it seems relevant to the story I started by telling you about what empty calendars feel like. Imelda has organized a small celebration at the center because, she informed me without asking whether I wanted this, the children there had decided that helping to plan my birthday was part of their community programming for the month. Glenn and Tom and Susan and Manny and Gloria will come for dinner on the actual birthday evening, at a restaurant on the waterfront that Manny knows the owner of, and where I've eaten enough times that the owner now seats us without asking what we'd prefer, and brings items off the menu that aren't on the menu, because he's decided, based on some opaque personal calculus, what we should be eating on a given evening, and he has been right every single time. Cassie and David and Marcus and Lily arrive 2 days before and stay for 10 days, and Lily has already emailed me a list of things she intends to see while she's here, compiled, apparently, from several hours of independent research, which I found so touching and so specifically her that I printed it out and put it on my refrigerator where I can see it from the table where I have coffee every morning. Rodrigo, my landlord, who started as a professional relationship and became something warmer over 14 months of unexpected conversations about architecture and urbanism in a city that is growing faster than its infrastructure, and that has, in Rodrigo's view, a great deal of unrealized potential if the right people could be persuaded to think seriously about it, has asked me whether I'd be interested in consulting on a small residential development project he's planning. 12 units designed specifically for retirees, and we've had 3 long dinners about it already, drawing on napkins the way architects and people who like architects will inevitably draw on napkins when the conversation gets specific enough. And there is something happening in those dinners that feels like work in the best sense of the word, the sense where work and purpose and engagement all mean the same thing. I want to say something about loneliness, because I think it would be dishonest not to, and because I think anyone considering something like this deserves an honest accounting of what the emotional landscape actually looks like from inside it, rather than just the high points. I miss Cassie with a regularity and a depth that hasn't diminished in 14 months. I miss Marcus and Lily in the specific way that distance makes the moments you do have more vivid and the gaps between them more noticeable. There are evenings when the apartment is quiet and the light off the water is doing something beautiful that I would have, in another life, turned to show Ellen, and the fact of her absence is as present in those moments as it has ever been in 11 years, which is to say, it is very present indeed. And I've learned enough about grief to know that the presence doesn't mean the healing isn't happening, it just means the love was real, and real love doesn't dissolve because it no longer has a living person to attach itself to, it just finds different shapes to take. But loneliness, the particular grinding, ambient loneliness of an unused life, the loneliness of sitting in a familiar house in a familiar city with familiar things all around you that have stopped meaning anything because all the meaning was stored in someone who is no longer there. That loneliness, I do not.
These days, for the first time in longer than I'd like to admit, I wake up most mornings already thinking about the day ahead instead of just enduring it, already running through before my feet even hit the floor, whatever small thing needs doing, whoever's expecting to see me, whatever ordinary plan the day already has in motion, whether I have much of an opinion about it or not. I don't say that to suggest everything is perfect now, because it isn't, and I don't think any honest version of a story like this should pretend otherwise. There are still hard days. There's still an ache that never fully closes, and I've come to accept that it probably never will, and that this is all right, that it doesn't need fixing the way I once assumed it did. But underneath that ache, there's also now a real and steady pull toward tomorrow, something I'd lost for a long stretch of time and genuinely wasn't sure I'd get back. I did get it back, though, not all at once, and not because of any single dramatic decision, but because of a long accumulation of small, deliberate choices, each one modest on its own, that eventually added up to an entirely different life than the one I'd been quietly drowning in before.